Welcome to Season 5, Episode 5 of Solarpunk Presents. Today I'm talking to Paweł Ngei about whether we want to start inviting tech into our communities instead of having tech forced upon us by third parties like companies who just want to make money. Two things before we dive into this episode. I'm very sorry for all the birdsong in the background when I speak. Sorry, it's the birds that are singing. It's just that time of year and it's too warm to have to close the windows to shut out the sound of the birds. And the second thing is, don't forget to support us on Patreon and by subscribing to our YouTube channel and clicking like on the videos, especially if you like listening to our podcast. Thank you. So I guess we'll start today by I'll ask Paweł to introduce himself a little bit and tell us what he's interested in.
Hello, I am a hacker, and it's someone who is kind of a technologist and engineer at once, who wants to analyze technology and open the black boxes, understand how is it supposed to function and use it in all the different ways, which leads me into being technologist in context of culture and trying to find how can we explain technology, how can we explain stories around it. And since I work in cybersecurity and as a software developer, I need to have a lot of context of how to create modern technology. So I'm trying to help writers and help people discuss it and see things that they may not normally see in technology.
You are a super big fan of Solarpunk for this reason, I guess.
Yes. I actually encountered Solarpunk because I was looking for a way to talk about technology. And I realized that our current culture doesn't really allow us to discuss it in a lot of ways.
Because we just accept these great tech breakthroughs that come through and these shiny new things that we can buy that are fun to play with.
That's the thing. We don't even accept it. We kind of don't see the technology in products. We talk about products, we talk about what marketing is giving us, and technology behind a lot of things in our life is completely invisible for us. And we don't have a cultural way of talking about how things work and what are the consequences of them working this way. It's absolutely natural that we will not understand each aspect of a smartphone or a car and how they work, but a lot of decisions that went into designing a car or a smartphone impact our lives. And we could be aware of how they work and how they could work differently so that our lives, our communities and cultures could have very different shape.
As tech has become more complex, it's not quite as mechanical as it used to be. It has become more of a black box, and companies have designed products where you just don't see the inner workings. Right? So it used to be like people could fix cars, and now it's to the point where you have to have computers in order to fix a car because of so many electronic components, for instance.
I don't think that it needs to be this way, and I don't think there's like a causal relation. I think it's kind of a culture push from companies, from capitalism as it is, for us to understand technology less and to question technology less. Because if you think like 50 years back, a lot of people were able to fix a lot of tech around them. And yes, technology was simpler, but there was also kind of a cultural notion of like cultural allowance of tweaking with technology. And right now, we have some people who are overly specialized in specific branches of technology, but we don't see people being able to tweak tech around them. There are several brands that specifically tell users, and you see, this is users, this is clients, this is not like people, this is putting people in a very specific box. Our technology gives you as few choices as possible, and this is a great thing because you do not need to think about it. And this limits us because we cannot think, I would like smartphones to work differently. I would like, for example, my music to be on my device. So even without the internet, without spending money on the internet, without spending energy on the internet, I would like to listen to the music I bought. And right now music is in the cloud. Everything is in the cloud because of some business reasons. And we are not conscious at all times that this is a business reason. For us, it was sold as a convenience. And there are a lot of aspects of technology like this where we do not see why something was designed like this. We just kind of accept it. And the exact story which got me into Solarpunk was exactly trying to explain to people, why do we want to modify technology? Like, why would you want to open something that kind of works and make it work differently? And after a few years of research, I realized that a very interesting way of explaining this, which is accessible, is through disability. Showing somebody who is disabled, who cannot use technology, how it's created for an average person, and seeing how they struggle and how they need to adjust technology for themselves because they do not want to adjust themselves and their own body to technology. And the story, it's something that I co-authored and it's online. The project is called Glider Inc. And the story describes an inventor, hacker, who was born without her right hand, and she really likes photography. But for some reason, we do not have semi-professional or professional photo cameras with buttons on the left side. And if you do not have your right hand, you are extremely limited in how you can use photo cameras. You can play with smartphones, you can play with some camera-like devices, but you cannot really get into the nitty-gritty of photography as you want. And by sharing a story of somebody who cannot use technology and needs to modify it to match themselves, I was able to explain to somebody for whom this was completely puzzling, that we may want to use technology differently than it is given to us.
Right. So this would be putting the interests of people over the interests of companies who say don't want to spend the money making two identical types of cameras, except that they're mirror images of one another. And it is true. I mean, trying to use a camera with your left hand, like a real camera where you have to change the f-stop and focus, that is nigh on impossible from the other side. And as I think I told you earlier, the first time I talked to you, I also have a problem with cameras, even though I'm not disabled, because I'm left-eyed, not right-eyed. And anytime you're using a normal camera and you're holding it with your right hand because you have to adjust the settings, you're going to be poking yourself in the right eye with your thumb if you hold it up to your left eye. That without, it hasn't stopped me from using cameras, but it has driven me crazy for decades.
I absolutely understand. I've been modifying technology I use for like over 17 years. And at this point, I cannot imagine living with technology I don't modify. It's just, I always adjust something. And it is such a weird thing to explain to people who do not have this cultural notion of you can modify technology. You can swap parts. And even if something is not made to be swappable or modifiable, you still can do it. You just need to go a little deeper into how to do it.
Okay, so what kind of tech have you modified for yourself?
Oh, a lot of things. The computer I use, the phone I use are the most basic things. I also build a lot of devices, and together with my spouse, we are hackers makers. We have a 3D printer, being aware that this is not a cure-all solution to modify everything, but just being able to build a 3D printer and make some questions like, are we okay with microplastics, which are going to be created in the process of printing? Are we okay with buying plastic and, for example, not using reusable one? Because we already have technology to reuse plastic and make it into filament, but it is not something which is like commercially available, and the vast majority of filaments are produced just from plastic. And I find it quite interesting how even 3D printers are being described in culture. And going back to like why Solarpunk, I encountered something really interesting. With 3D printers, we used to have this huge scare, oh no, you can 3D print a gun. And if you are into engineering, you realize that if you try 3D printing a gun, it has like 50% of blowing up in your face.
Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't call this part a threat of 3D printers, but it made me realize how different genres of fiction, how different parts of culture look at technology. This is where I saw the chance for Solarpunk. Because if you look at like popular culture around us, if you look at, for example, the superhero cinema or the action movies, there's this notion, which is very implicit, very unspoken, that every piece of technology must be a weapon, that everything is either used to hurt or not important to the story. Some movies even make fun of this. They are like self-conscious. And in some recent Spider-Man movies, there are people who lose their jobs because of superheroes and they find some alien or superhero scrap. And instead of reverse engineering it to make into some power sources or anything and selling them to hospitals, to universities, they decide to make guns out of it because it's like the only thing you are supposed to imagine. And if you go to another genre, if you go to, for example, cyberpunk fiction or our default future, as a lot of people see it, there's this really interesting dichotomy around technology because you can see the tech is always either about oppressing people and controlling them by the state, by the corporations, or the tech is about fighting this oppression. There's nothing in between. And this is very interesting because you cannot imagine a piece of technology which would be completely out of the conflict or anything which would be usable like after the conflict. And this is something that really puzzled me, that you cannot tell a lot of stories. Like you cannot tell a story of Wikipedia in cyberpunk fiction. Because if you want to imagine something which is like created by essentially everyone, and even despite all the flaws, it's like a huge utopian project where everybody co-creates a free available body of knowledge and everybody can have access to it as long as they have access to the internet. In cyberpunk you could only show it as either a tool of oppression because the state is modifying things and changing history on the state-sponsored Wikipedia, or some way where that rebels are teaching people how to make bombs. You cannot tell about a neutral project in cyberpunk story. And this is where I realized that Solarpunk, trying to imagine a sustainable future and not only climate sustainable, but culturally sustainable and also technologically sustainable future, can imagine technologies much closer to my definition, can imagine technologies as infrastructure. So the whole context of, oh, I have a piece of technology. How was it produced? How will I prepare it? What will happen with it afterwards? What is the supply chain? And what are all the decisions which shape it? In Solarpunk, I could start looking at it because suddenly trains are technology, because trains are Solarpunk, and understanding that laying tracks and optimizing the schedules of trains and making sure that everybody has a way to sit, whether they are on a wheelchair or whether they have a bike. This is all technology we could talk about in Solarpunk, and it's not something that could be a subject of other genres of fiction. And suddenly in Solarpunk, we could define technology not as something external, but as a part of community and essentially a result of community, of all the decisions that community makes, which I hope are conscious, and all the traditions and conflicts and everything, because this technology becomes the expression of community and how it wants to see the world and how it wants to live.
That's interesting because I would think most of the technology we do use for other purposes other than to be controlled or to fight back. So it's weird that we have this totally, well, maybe it's not weird that we have this totally unimaginative view in the superhero genre. Actually, that's probably not weird at all, considering the history of that genre. Maybe it's a bit weird in cyberpunk. But I actually want to get back to your 3D printer here for a second. Because what you were saying about the plastic and how you have to think about whether or not you want to be using, generating microplastics, because you start off with all these nurdles or whatever, all this plastic that the printer melts in order to create the pieces that you need. This is what you get when you start to look under the hood and you start to see how things work, and you have to see what goes into making something or putting this together. And I think this is what we very conveniently have just stopped doing because we don't want to be responsible for it. We don't want to lose sleep over it. We don't want to have to solve these problems, and we don't really want to have to pay the price of the things that we have.
Exactly. And the same comes for example, a lot of energy, because a lot of solar punks are, oh, I want solar panels. I want wind turbines. I don't want oil because I understand how bad oil is. But we have a lot of questions about, we have so many kinds of wind turbines. We have so many kinds of solar panels. And now, do we have a good way of recycling them? Do
Yeah,
we
not yet.
have Yeah, not yet. So wouldn't it be the most solar punk thing and the biggest priority to actually lobby for the biggest research into recycling renewable energy infrastructure? For me, this is something that is extremely interesting, and very few people are actually talking about it. We have huge questions about energy storage, where nice solar panels work when sun shines, and they work much better at the equator than they work in Europe or in Canada, for example. And wind turbines work much better when it's windy. And it's great that they can fulfill like 50% of your energy needs when it's windy. But we need a way to store energy. And those are the uncomfortable questions that we need to look at, that I believe are great questions for Solarpunk. And there will be things that may be uncomfortable from like naively societal aspect, because for example, a lot of people involved in Solarpunk are, oh, I want microgrids. I like homesteading. I do not want to be part of any big project. I do not want any big projects because I know there will be pollution and so on and so forth. But we may actually need to think, okay, what about batteries? What about building some way of storing energy? Is gravitational energy and essentially using huge cranes to just charge the battery appropriate? What will be the ecological consequence of creating something? What will be the consequences of a solar farm if we put a lot of solar panels next to each other? There may be some solutions which will be good. Like if you calculate everything, they may not be aesthetically nice for us, but it will turn out that this is actually the best way for ecosystems. This will be the best way for people to actually use the energy grid. I think we should be thinking about technology and energy grids and infrastructure like much wider, and accepting that those will be uncomfortable questions, and we will not escape them by living in a van with a single solar panel on top and saying that, oh, I feel I'm self-sustainable and I do not need to worry about anyone else.
So, do you think we're educated enough to be able to tackle these kinds of problems?
And the big question is, who is we?
All of us.
So
Really, I mean, all of us.
I do not think we are all educated enough, and I do not think it's feasible to educate all of us. And that's why I'm really interested in Solarpunk as a fictional genre, because I do not expect everyone to start reading handbooks and like huge physics or chemistry analysis and studies on what is the best way to produce energy or to store energy. What I think we could do is start telling stories about this. Because I believe that we lost the ability to perceive technology because we stopped telling stories about it, because we allowed our stories to start containing magical boxes and not look inside. If just a few authors start telling attractive stories, something that would be interesting, which would contain notions of, we need to think about infrastructure, we need to think about what this technology does to our community, then this could be via essentially cultural osmosis accepted by an average person. Because if, like, let's imagine already a better world where solarpunk stories are popular, your soap opera has solarpunk themes, you read books that have solarpunk elements, and you kind of get those things just from the context. You are not trying actively to get educated, but you get the idea, and you are not bound to a single ideology or a single aesthetic of, oh, I want my future to be this way. But the power of Solarpunk is prototyping different futures and telling you, would we want it to work this way? Would we want it to work differently? And the books that I really appreciate in Solarpunk are the ones that are openly saying, hey, this is an idea how the world could function. Do we want it to function this way?
Science fiction, in principle, should be about what possibilities technology opens us up to, and how, what are the unintended consequences of it, and what do people do with it that the designers didn't imagine. But normally science fiction takes it in a negative direction. I'm thinking of like Black Mirror, right? Which really explores exactly how bad technology allows us to be to other human beings. And it's fascinating. I mean, I love that show. You can't watch too much of it in a stretch, but it's definitely not Solarpunk, right? But wouldn't that be interesting if we flipped it the other way around and found interesting, exciting, dramatic stories in how much better we can get things done if we're very careful about the technology that we develop and in the ways that we develop it? While you were talking, I had an idea, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? So lately there's been a call for having stories that have multiple points of view in them rather than just a single hero that goes through the standard hero story arc. But wouldn't it also be interesting if we started to more frequently have multiple authors on stories, so that you could team up, say, an engineer, a scientist, and a philosopher, or someone who thinks a lot about social justice, so that you can actually cover all of these very solarpunky things in a single story. I mean, it's hard to be an engineer and someone who knows a lot about social justice. There are very different skill sets and very different literatures and very different communities and networks.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is something that I already do because I'm a co-writer for a podcast called Solarpunk Prompts. And while I'm very open about not being a good writer myself, I would like to share my research with writers. And I don't mean, oh, this technology is interesting because it can do this many gigajoules with this many seconds of whatever. This is not an interesting story. But finding things which stem from a technological decision, which stem from a specific infrastructure. There are a lot of stories which could showcase us things. And in Solarpunk prompts, there are prompts like there is a prototype container ship, which is not just 12 or 30% sail power, but which is 100% sail and solar power, and it's traveling the world trying to prove that it's viable and what would be the consequences of such technology, but not only, oh, it would mean this many percent of efficiency and so on, but let's imagine actually like the first voyage of such ship, and let's put it against all the climate stories we may have. So let's imagine this ship is supposed to go from point A to point B, but suddenly there is a call, oh no, there was a major disaster, you actually must go and help because humanitarian help will not get that small island in time. So you must actually divert. And suddenly you have a few refugees on your ship living among all the engineers working day to day. And for me, that is an interesting story because it sets your expectations of, oh, this will be just about efficiency and some nice aesthetics. No, this is a story about how the technology will appear, like will be developed in a context of we will have a lot of humanitarian problems in the future, and we need to calculate them in.
You're reminding me, I had a story idea a number of years ago about a fleet of autonomous sailboats, and they don't have sails. They use these columns that rotate in the wind, and that actually can be just as effective as a sail. Without being quite so fragile. I can't remember the name of it. There's a local university here that has developed some of these autonomous sailboats, and you can sort of give them, like, you sail back and forth along this line, and then you could have a fleet because you got LiDAR and all sorts of, and what are the not the tracking devices, but the things that ships and airplanes use to talk to each other, the transponders, or
Yeah.
So the ships in the fleet could all keep track of each other, and then they could sail back and forth. My idea was that they would actually be spraying seawater into the air to create clouds to cool the ocean surface. In a part of the ocean where, yeah, it's long and complicated. You can see why this didn't work as a story, where you could actually shift the high pressure system or the low pressure system. I forget the details, and then you would change ocean circulation a bit to back to a pre-global warming configuration that would not melt the ice shelves around Antarctica as fast as they're melting. But I never found the story in that. I thought you could have a soap opera like situation with the people trying to set this up to save the Antarctic ice sheet, but yeah, by saving the Antarctic ice shelves. But who knows if a reader would sit through the full explanation of all of that.
Yeah, because we have writers who tackled several similar subjects, like Kim Stanley's Robinson Ministry for the Future actually had the Arctic pipelines, and they specifically pumped the water from under the ice sheets on top so that it would freeze. But for me, that was extremely interesting because I've spoken with a few researchers who were in the subject and actually read the book. And again, the context that we didn't see, because a lot of readers saw that this is a really giant, like huge project. This is a project that would require humanity to collaborate together. Nice. But in the book, first, we didn't have any grand problems. We didn't have any scientific debate. It was kind of just decided that this is the best thing. And for me, this is one interesting issue. Another was that it was all propped by the old systems, and a lot of oil companies were asked to help. So, okay, you will not dig oil anymore, but could you help us dig ice? And they were paid for it, which introduced a really interesting situation where you're trying not to mess up with capitalism by essentially redirecting it. But then you can arrive at problems. Okay, once they do it, what's next? Because there will be those nets of power, and every technology introduces some power. This is something that we also need to think in context of Solarpunk. If we create a technology which does something, how do we want to finance it? Because we don't need to think about magical points of value that banks create, but there will be human labor which will be assigned to different tasks. And how do we want to think about that? What will be like emergent behaviors stemming from very specific models that we want to implement? If we want to commercialize something, if we want to nationalize something, there will be a lot of questions that we shouldn't be afraid of asking and stating so that we can discuss it. Like, for example, with train systems worldwide, the European train system is considered one of the best, if not the best in the world. But it's almost impossible to get a single ticket from one country to another, or even going through a third country. While if you take a plane, it's just you go to a website, you buy it, done. And suddenly we have the infrastructure and technology which would allow you to either take a single train, or if the gauge changes and you would need to swap a train, to at least buy a single ticket and have it coordinated. But we do not have this layer. And this, you can say this is a bureaucracy problem, but this is really a problem of culture and technology. Why have we never pushed for such a thing if we want to use trains instead of planes?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the main problem is that on a long distance train ride, you're often changing train companies, and they aren't necessarily all talking to each other. When I first lived in Germany, I worked for a couple months in Sweden, and I thought it was so cool. I could actually walk a mile from my house, so like 1.6 kilometers, get on a train, and yeah, I'd have to change trains a couple times, but then I could go through Denmark and actually get to Sweden. And then from the train station in Sweden, I would walk another 1.6 kilometers to the apartment I was staying in. I thought that was just awesome. And with the website of the German train system, the Deutsche Bahn, I could buy a ticket that would take me from basically my house in Germany to the apartment in Sweden where I was staying. But what I discovered was when one time when I didn't buy a round trip ticket because I didn't know when I was coming home, when I went to the train station in Sweden, they're like, "What? You want a ticket to Germany? Like the best we can do is get you a ticket to Copenhagen," which was, like 45 minutes away. It wasn't even far away. It was just over the bridge from where I was working. And then you'll have to buy a ticket there. And so
Yeah.
then and it was ridiculous and it was insanely expensive. And then I couldn't get a ticket that would stop at the stop I needed to stop at. So I had to spend way more money to buy in order to get just to take the last 5 miles of the train. And that was really crazy. And
Yeah.
yeah, completely unnecessary.
Yeah. And this is not something that will be solved by just hand waving and saying entrepreneurship, or saying like the market will fix it, or saying the government will mandate. But this is something that needs pressure from the people saying that they want it. And this is something that, again, this is a huge chance for Solarpunk, because what I see is when you look at the Extinction Rebellion, when you look at a lot of protest movements around climate, you see people just saying no, like just no for oil, just start doing something else, even if they can get people's attention, even if they can do something scandalous enough so that everybody reads it on the news, they do not sustain anyone's attention because they do not show towards what world can we move. And an average person cannot imagine what is the world that we could, in which we could solve the problems differently. And this is the chance for Solarpunk for me. If we create a lot of proposals, hey, our trains could run like this, and this is not a far future 100 years later story. This is like in 2 years, we could create a single ticket system within Europe. In 20 years, we could start fixing infrastructure in different regions on different continents. And those are not just impossible projects. We can show people this would be possible. Do we want it? And we can start just showing stories which include that. And those stories don't need to be just for train lovers. We can just show daily problems of people, just shown against the backdrop of the climate catastrophe, but also very relatable. And there is just so much. There is a lot of stuff around healthcare. And this is something that we are not discussing about technology in healthcare, which for me is extremely interesting, but it's kind of not a topic. When you hear about new medical technology, it will be, oh, it will come to the hospitals. In the US, it will be, oh my God, it will be so expensive. Will we be able to afford it? Will it be covered by my insurance? But we do not question how we want it to work within like infrastructure and within the society. One of my favorite examples is even in Poland, we have about 30,000 people with brain implants. And it's not just a simple pacemaker, which I would say it's a little simpler, but brain implant which you need to function daily. You need an implant to hear, you need an implant to move your limbs, and you actually need a piece of technology with a battery inside of you to function. It's not far future, it's already here. And this works within public medical insurance. You need to go to a hospital and ask for a new battery for your brain implant. And because it's so far away from popular culture, a lot of nurses and even doctors will be like, "You what? We give people brain implants? Like how does it? How do I file this? Into which form? I have no idea." And I actually was asked to help one person whose doctor went away and no one else had any idea how to get them new brain implant batteries. And they were
Okay, that's
already
awkward.
yes, that's awkward. And this is at the level where this is not 100 years in the future. This is now. And if you can imagine going to a hospital with an awkward problem or a weird pimple, imagine just going to the hospital, my limbs are stopping moving. Could we do something so that you recharge my battery because I need this to function? Those are the stories which currently we can perceive as like this is far science fiction, far future, but it's around us. And we can start looking at it and telling stories which will normalize it and which will make people think that this is something we can talk about. It will not be invisible anymore.
So I've recently caved in. I'm such a naysayer. Like, so I don't listen to music on my phone. I actually have a Sony Walkman that plays MP3 files. But so I finally caved in and got Netflix about a month ago. I've already basically exhausted everything interesting to see there. And so now I'm down to the second tier stuff. And I saw something a couple weeks ago, which I think was called Signals. I don't remember 100% if that's what the title, but it was German, and it was about a woman who's an astronaut, and she leaves her daughter and husband behind to go up onto the space station, and she hears signals, like this broadcast that's coming over, I think radio waves it was, from outside the solar system. And her daughter has one of these brain implants. It sort of magnetically attaches her hearing aid to her head. And I thought this was science fiction. I did not realize this was a real thing. And I was talking to my spouse about it a couple days ago. And he's like, oh, yeah, when, the first place we lived here in Germany, the place where I could walk to the little train station, not our next door neighbor, but the guy next to our next door neighbor was actually the surgeon who was in charge of putting these implants into kids' brains in the local university hospital. So I was like, it's been all around me and I had no idea.
Yeah, and you can hear marketing about the new brain implants coming from the US. They will change everything. We kind of had them for a long time. And unless we discuss what is the breakthrough, we should be like, okay, so show us what does it do?
When you were talking earlier about the role of Solarpunk versus just saying no, we don't want that, and we're gonna throw ketchup on the Mona Lisa or whatever to make our point. It's just so easy to say no, and then you feel powerful. Like, I have the power to say no. And it is so much harder to imagine something, to create, to generate ideas and open up spaces and to get things done, especially when we're talking about complicated, complex things.
Yes, and those things will be uncomfortable, and people doing those things will not be praised as heroes. Again, something connected to how our culture is. We are kind of preconditioned to see single heroes, like this is the person that invented something. It's not a work of 100 scientists working on it. There's this one genius person, and we kind of expect Iron Man behind everything and this single face of every solution. Solarpunk needs to start praising people working quietly in the background and preparing things, preparing those contexts, preparing solutions. And only with that, like for me, again, the best barometer here is Wikipedia. We do not have any story I am aware of which praises Wikipedians as this archetype of librarians, because we have a lot of stories about librarians and how wonderful they are. But look for a story which portrays the protagonist, the hero that is worth of praise, that just goes places and catalogs things to put them on the internet, or argues with people what is notable and what is not, or what is the function of this article and should we do this or that. Unless we start being able to describe Wikipedia as a project, as something really notable, we will not be able to talk about all the people that are doing the work we need for the Solarpunk future.
I really love this idea of a Solarpunk soap opera, because it would totally be a way that you could tell the story of a project, and yet you have all the drama and conflict, because you have all these relationships between all the different people with all the different types of expertise and all the different opinions that go into getting things done.
Yes, and this is something that I first encountered when somebody was ridiculing Solarpunk to me. Like, there's no conflict, there's nothing interesting. What is this, a soap opera? Soap operas have a lot of interesting tension. And if you start portraying characters living together, like as a family unit, maybe some friends living together, maybe one of the co-living projects where you have several families living in a townhouse, which I feel would be very Solarpunk, just living together and sharing different facilities
Oh, in a
between.
co-housing arrangement.
Exactly. If you set this as your essentially set for the whole story, you can tell a lot of smaller stories. You can show people how different people have tractions, like have problems, have dramas, and how they celebrate successes, how different climate problems touch them. Because, oh, maybe somebody is completely unfazed by the heat wave. They have really good AC in their office building, but everybody else at home is just, oh my, we need to do something for the better heat insulation of the building. And oh, we should have thought about it before summer. And those daily problems that are like filler episodes can be really interesting because they give you this context so that you don't need to read a book about what will be climate problems. You will see how they impact people. What can we do with it? And suddenly, next time there is like a huge project, how to build residential buildings, people will be like, oh, actually, if we have something with good thermal capacity so that we don't need AC, that would be great.
You could call it As the World Burns instead of As the World Turns. Okay, yeah, that's not
Yes,
particularly solar punk.
that's
But
pretty
you're
dark.
reminding me of this British sort of radio soap opera called The Archers.
I don't know. I
It's
haven't heard.
I never really listened to it when I lived in the UK, but it's a big thing and it's gone on for years and years and years, and it takes place in the countryside. And so you've got this backdrop of farming. So it's always, you've got what the soap opera between the characters, but then you also have, the tractors and all of, what's going on in the fields and what the farmers are up to at the particular time of year and what problems they're facing and the dilemmas of country life. And I think that people mock soap operas. I mean, they're easy to laugh at, but have you ever read any of the old Icelandic sagas from like 1,000 years ago or
Not
longer?
directly, but I know what you're talking about
They are
because
soap operas.
yes, and even in Poland, we had several examples of educational soap operas or like comedy soap operas. And we had huge successes in, for example, teaching people about disability, because we had this really interesting character who wanted to be a football player and everybody wanted him to succeed. But at some point, he had an accident, he broke his spine, and for the rest of the soap opera, he was wheelchair bound. And this was a breakthrough because suddenly a huge part of population realized how many problems there are that wheelchair users actually face. There was so much interesting educational stuff you could do with that. We had another which was essentially about a foster family, which was a comedy, but it showed people a lot of minorities and their problems in Poland back in the day when we had very little discourse about minorities. And this opens so many discussions. And this is such a good cultural vehicle. Even if it's not something for the first channel of public TV, even if it's something as, a YouTube series or anything which could reach people outside of being state sponsored, this is a really good way of discussing problems and discussing how technology impacts our lives, how bureaucracy organization impacts our lives. How do we want to organize ourselves? And this is a really big part of what I see interesting in Solarpunk. And I see books like, for example, A Half-Built Garden by Ruth Anna Emrys. In The Half-Built Garden, one of the main plots within the book is how the social network slash decision making software works within the community and how it was attacked by someone who started changing algorithms. Because right now, if we talk about social media, we have algorithms that are stealing your attention, which are specifically optimized to make you spend more time on that social media. And we cannot imagine social media which is specifically geared towards helping a community and helping them make decisions. We already have several really interesting projects. Like, for example, there's Polis, the ancient Greek polis, but POL.is,
Mm-hmm.
which is a social media which is made to depolarize people, to help them make decisions, help them arrive at consensus, essentially. And this is not something that a lot of people consider when thinking about software for a community. And in the half-built garden, the biggest problem that is in the background of everything the main characters are doing is, can we reach consensus without all of the technology, which is essentially all of our traditions and rituals of how we reach a consensus? And the admins working in the background are at the same time your really grumpy computer people. Someone broke it, who tripped over the cable? And they are actually the community mediators, because they are responsible for how community communicates with itself, like within itself and with other communities. And if we start seeing how the technology we use starts impacting who we are as community, how we make decisions, this could really help us in the future. Because I've seen so many success stories and so many failure stories of how one bad decision in creating a technological process changed community. Where, for example, a lot of current platforms, on a lot of people, a lot of even Extinction Rebellion and similar movements organized on Facebook. And those platforms appoint specific people to have absolute power. You cannot implement, like, as a programmer, you could implement Facebook in a way where you would need to have a council or a consensus, but it is not how it works. And now you have movements where one person that wants to do something, that wants to destroy a movement or just has an argument, can essentially shut down the whole movement and cut people's way of communicating with each other, essentially stop them from coordinating. And this is interesting for me, that when we are talking technologies, we could also talk about what are the power structures with that. And also, if we accept a technology, and this is regarding the discussion with Web3 and similar, are we aware that if we have a technology that only one person within community knows how to operate, we cannot believe that something is truly transparent or that something allows us to make decisions together, because that one person has the full power to audit it, to modify it, and no one else can check it. And for thousands of years, we specifically created ways of organizing that would be accessible, law systems that would be transparent and accessible, and paper ballots. And the moment we start transitioning to digital technologies, whether it's Web3 or anything else, we can encounter a trap where we are giving all the power within our community to a singular person. And I've met communities where, be it with blockchain or not, this one engineer had held so much power that everyone else needed to essentially listen to them. They were suddenly the most important member of the community, even though everybody was supposed to be equal. And this is interesting for me. This is also a great material for a story if you want dramatism.
Well, it's also frightening because okay, so I'm not a tech person. I'm a scientist, but I'm not a tech person. But I see Amazon, I see Google, I see what used to be Facebook and is now Meta. I even see, what they're trying to do with what used to be Twitter. And then you've got the Chinese companies like, I guess it's Weibo but you see that there's all of these big companies run by very, very rich men who are richer every year. And they want to, they see that there is this cyberspace, metaverse, whatever you want to call it, coming, where we're going to shop, where we're going to hang out, where we're going to spend our time, where we're going to communicate with people, where we're going to, entertain ourselves. And they want to be the gateway to that. And they want to have all the control over that. And I really feel like the rest of us are just kind of letting all this happen. The governments are letting this happen. And because we don't, what would you do to fight against this? Okay, the only thing I can do to fight against this, I haven't shopped on Amazon in almost 20 years. Okay, we've got an Instagram account for the podcast, but I don't have any personal accounts with Meta. Yeah, before I was doing all of this stuff with the podcast, I didn't have a Gmail account and I didn't use the Google Drives. Aside from that, I try and where I'm collaborating with my co-host, I try not to put anything on the cloud. The only way I know how to deal with this is to say no. I didn't even have a smartphone until like a year ago because I didn't want to be tracked. I didn't want to be advertised to. I've got the ad blocker on my computer, but that's all, you get shut out of society if you refuse to participate in these things. I didn't
Yeah.
have Netflix, right? I mean, all these things. And it's so weird kind of caving into all of this stuff. And you open one door and then you just keep walking further through until you're totally trapped in the net along with everyone else.
This is interesting from several reasons, because I completely understand what you're feeling right now. I've been actually teaching cybersecurity and privacy to beginners and in high schools at some universities for the last 10 years. And I learned that it is really easy to get lost in, oh my God, everything is bad. Everybody will steal my data. Like there's no way out of it. But actually, there are ways. And what we can do, especially working with culture, is talking about those ways. Because in addition to Instagram, you also have, for example, a Mastodon account. And Mastodon as a decentralized and independent social media, where one server closes, you can move to another. There is no single owner that will say that you need to do this or I'm taking away all your data. We have those protocols. We have things created by the free software community or by those hackers who want to imagine technology differently. And now what we can do is we can start imagining futures with different technologies, just not defaulting to cyberpunk mega corporations, but seeing different things and also seeing the shapes of communities and the problems that this brings. One of the interesting aspects, for example, is with a lot of stuff from Google, with a lot of stuff from Meta, Facebook, Instagram, and so on, you got convinced that those things can be free, like that you use it without paying for it. Of course, there are some premium plans, but there was this conviction that you don't need to pay with money. And yes, they take your attention, they take your data and use it, but we can also think about it differently. So, okay, we know that servers, that writing code, that being a moderator takes work, takes time, takes energy, both human energy and like electricity. So, how can we do it differently? And we can say there are Mastodon instances where everybody pays, for example, 10 euro a year for the instance to continue working, for the moderator to spend some time, or the administrator to spend some time to actually help with moderation. And can we imagine a future where we normalize that some parts of the internet are paid and it's okay? And if we don't want that, how can we imagine those becoming essentially public utilities? Because if you think about it, you don't pay for walking on the streets, for using the pavement. So this is essentially from your taxes. Why wouldn't such a service be also paid for from your taxes? But we haven't had this discussion, not because just some evil lobbyist paid someone in the European Parliament, but we kind of never imagined this on the scale to get enough people to ask this question. Again, the solution is not in the hands of a single technologist, but the Solarpunk community, which can start telling the stories of how the world could work differently, asking people, would you like it to work like this, or like this, or like this? And then we could start pushing towards the world we want in terms of privacy and in terms of independence from big technologies.
Need a critical, organized mass. But this is an interesting point because, if we go back to the rail system, and you can look in Europe at how much privatization of the rail system, of just the rail network, has totally destroyed the rail system in Europe. I mean, it's very sad to hear that it's the best in the world. I mean, in Germany at the moment, it's a disaster. Trains are late or canceled. And I mean, at the moment, you can't get between Kiel and Hamburg, so Kiel's the nearest big city to me. You're gonna be at least an hour late every time, sometimes more, for a journey that takes 45 minutes on an intercity express train and an hour and a half on the regional train. So to be minimum an hour late is completely ridiculous. And so people think, okay, there should be a company in charge of the rail network, in charge of maintaining it, and then it makes its money by charging the train companies money. And it's totally acceptable that they should be able to make a profit and that they should be able to pay their shareholders. But you would never say, okay, we're going to privatize the road network, right? Okay, you might have a toll road here and there, but you're not going to privatize the entire road network because it's way too critical to the functioning of people's lives and the economy.
I believe that there are places which tried in the world and it ended very badly, but I think some people tried. It's just, this is proven to be so horrendous and failing so fast that nobody else takes this.
So it's weird what we've decided culturally is acceptable to be something you squeeze profit out of. In fact, something that you ought to squeeze profit out of, like hospitals, for instance. And things that we've said, no, that's ridiculous. We would never squeeze. Well, why would you do it that way? And so you're right. We do have to ask ourselves, why do we have these attitudes? And or even what attitudes do we have that we're not even aware that we have?
Yes, exactly. And for me, the role of Solarpunk and creating fiction is showing us potential solutions. So the positivity doesn't come from there being no problems in a future system like this. Because if we had, for example, a European-wide institution that coordinates different trading companies, or like whether we want to make them national or however, there will be a lot of problems, infrastructural problems, bureaucracy problems. You can write stories with a lot of dramatism here. And this will not be utopian as in everything will be okay, but this will be a positive suggestion. Is this a world we want to go towards? And this is what I feel that we need. We need to start seeing a series of those proposals where we don't talk about 100 years in the future, a floating city with perfect economy. We are talking in 20 years. Let's imagine that Europe fixed this problem and that problem, and let's roll with it. Let's publish it. Let's have people discuss it. Or let's make a short movie about it, and like even a 10-minute short on YouTube. I'm actually pretty disappointed how a lot of those short futuristic stories on YouTube are tame. Like I tried watching a lot of those 10-minute shorts about, in the future there will be hunger, there will be drought, and the only way is this one plane. Let's stop with the hero narrative. Let's imagine what could be the systemic solutions. And yes, there will be problems with them, but is this something we want to have? Let's start rolling out suggestions for solutions. And for me, this is the role of Solarpunk. And a lot of interesting stories are here.
Okay, well, that sounds like a call to, well, not arms, maybe pens or keyboards, for Solarpunks to get out there, write us some soap operas about making systemic change and opening up the spaces that we can move into by carefully adopting technologies and understanding how it works, and show us all the fights and the relationships between people and all of this kind of stuff. Well, thank you very much. This has been a really, really interesting discussion.
Thank you as well.
And that's a wrap for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.